You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war.
Let's give thanks in this day of Thanksgiving. Let's give thanks for the joys of life, for the friends we have. Let's celebrate the gifts of life, big and small. Let's give thanks.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
We're on our way to Thanksgiving dinner.
With the in-laws, Tatiana's mom and her husband in Mendocino. We're about halfway to Mendocino at Clear Lake, California. We're actually parked in our vehicle looking over the lake.
Yep, we got some ducks flying around out there.
I love Thanksgiving. It's really the one time out of the year we make an effort to get together with the family.
Yeah, this is the main one when the whole family gathers is Thanksgiving, more than any other holiday for us.
Yeah, we don't do the Christmas thing most often.
Yeah, do I get to start my war on Christmas now?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to offer my support to everyone that hates Christmas. I'm right there with you. But anyway, this is Thanksgiving. I'm so excited to hate Christmas. I keep forgetting about Thanksgiving, which is a sweet holiday. It's just about getting together and thankfulness.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's non-religious, and it's pretty non-commercialistic. It's pretty cool, huh?
Well, what are the roots of Thanksgiving? Doesn't it go back to some Native American and Pilgrim harvest feast?
I don't know. I think that the roots really would just be traditional harvest celebrations that every culture has. But we did agree when I grew up at a time when there was this mythology about the first Thanksgiving and the Native Americans helping the Pilgrims,
right,
which was given to us as a heartwarming tale in grade school. But as time went on, people started to take issue with it because it's very simplistic, cartoonish version of history.
Yeah, and it ignores the horrible things that Europeans did to Native peoples over here, which is actually still going on, and a big part of the interview that you're gonna hear coming up soon.
Right, that's right. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's important enough for us to know the real history and not just go along with these sanitized versions that, they give us in grade school.
Right. It just ignores the ugly reality, the literal genocide that this country was built on, the conquistadors, which I just realized, I can't believe it's taken me so long, but that's just the Spanish word for conqueror. Conqueror.
Yeah.
Literally, they came and they conquered and killed the Mayans. And this episode is about drug war capitalism. And I interviewed Dawn Paley, who wrote the book called Drug War Capitalism. And it's really all about what's going on in Mexico right now and how the drug war down there is just an extension of this process of genocide and conquering, and Western corporations now who want to extract the resources of the country and use the drug war as a cover to murder indigenous populations that are standing in the way of resource extraction. She says 35,000 people a year murdered in Mexico, all under the cover of the drug war, when in reality there's much deeper, darker political, economic stuff going on. So this is a very heavy episode.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking repercussions. And the drug war, the mythology around the drug war is the perfect cover for all of this, because using misinformation and fear-mongering that they use to perpetuate the drug war mentality, they can go in there and wipe out communities. Young people basically get targeted.
Yeah, everyone, this episode is going to blow your mind. And, we tried to open up with something really happy. Here we are on Thanksgiving, and we really are giving thanks for everything that we have, but...
We're trying not to scare you off from listening to this episode.
We're trying to kind of make sure this episode isn't so completely and totally 100% dark and scary. But you really do need to prepare yourselves for what you're about to hear. It's really a paradigm-shifting interview for a lot of people who don't understand this. There is great evil in this world. Yeah, so I'm really trying to give thanks this Thanksgiving today. Not think about the interview, but be happy that I'm going to get to see your mom. I love your mom. She's great. And John, her husband, is awesome too. And Angelica, our daughter, is driving herself over. That's why she's not in the car with us right now because, Grammy Sue bought her own car. And she's 18 years old. They grow up so quick, people. If you have kids, you should love them to death and spend as much time as you can with them now before they grow up.
But my son, Alexi, isn't able to join us on the coast today.
Right.
He's staying inland so he can go to his wrestling meet, first wrestling meet.
That's a little sad that his school planned a wrestling meet on Thanksgiving weekend. So he's staying with his biological dad so he can do that. But, I remember that when I was his age. I love soccer, and I would never have wanted to miss a soccer game to go off with my family, Boring.
Yeah, he's very committed to his athletics.
Love your family, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving out there.
Yeah, we're just keeping it short and simple this time, sitting in the car on the side of the road.
Yeah, no housekeeping. I mean, we tell you go to our Patreon.
Subscribe.
Give us a review on iTunes, all that kind of stuff. But we're going to wrap this up because we're on our way to Thanksgiving. Love you all, everyone. Enjoy the interview coming right up as much as is possible. Dawn, thank you very much for being on the show. I have been a big fan of yours ever since I read Drug War Capitalism. So thank you for writing it. And tell me, first of all, why did you write it?
Well, I wrote Drug War Capitalism. I started in 2010, and it was in a moment politically where it felt like the anti-war movement, like against the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, in the US and Canada was still active, was still powerful. And I sort of wrote it in that context with the hope that folks in the United States and folks in Canada would start to think about the war on drugs in Colombia or in Mexico or in Central America as a U.S. war, that we should also be protesting actively on the streets and sort of including it within that discussion. That was sort of the political motivation. And then there was also just the fact that I had worked in Colombia and then had been in Mexico. And when I started hearing the reports about increased violence in Ciudad Juarez, increased violence in Mexico, at the same time as we knew that the U.S. was starting to shift their focus in terms of funding from Mexico to Colombia, I was kind of like, this is not a coincidence. We cannot allow this to be presented as a coincidence, to be presented as random violence. So it's just sort of that instinct of, we need to research and do interviews to try to bring some common sense into this that helps us explain and understand what's happening and not just sort of this random chaotic violence, which is often, how it's talked about in the media.
Right. Yeah. Most people think that drug war violence is coming solely from cartels competing with each other or U.S. and Mexican government efforts to stop the cartels. Nobody really understands the way that these systems work together and that there are bigger reasons for the drug war, that it serves as a cover for some nefarious stuff that goes on. How would you describe what's going on in a nutshell?
It's hard to ask about a whole book in a nutshell, but I guess a few perspectives. I think that state violence remains the key phenomenon. So I think of state violence, police violence. In the case of Mexico, you also have the army and the Marines active in the so-called war on drugs, right? Like the violence is emerging from militarization. And the sort of other kinds of fighting with cartels and those forces or between cartels has a lot to do with that initial push of what I call militarized prohibition. It's been since the Mexican government declared this war on drugs and started sending troops into Michoacan in December of 2006 with Felipe Calderón, who just became president, that the violence has really exploded. So a lot of the violence of the drug war, and I think we can say the same thing in the United States, is state violence, right? So it's racialized policing in the United States, the prison system, mass incarceration. And here in Mexico, it's policing the poor, policing by certain geographic areas. But instead of this sort of prison and the imprisonment being the key sort of mechanism of control, here it's massacre, murder, and disappearance and forced disappearance. But we see kind of similar things. It's really the state that is creating a large part of the violence. And then a lot of the other violence of cartels and, I call them actually paramilitary groups rather than cartels, sort of spin-off violence is connected to that initial thrust of state violence or militarized prohibition.
Yeah, right. And when did this start? What year was he elected?
Well, so I go back in the book I started in the year 2000 with Plan Colombia. Yep. Which started with President Pastrana, and that lasted basically until 2006. In 2006 in Mexico, President Felipe Calderón was elected. It was actually a fraudulent election, but he, managed to take power in December of 2006, initially started the drug war then. And the U.S. came on with funding with something called the Merida Initiative, which is just like Plan Colombia, starting in 2008.
Yeah, and so if we look at drug use in the United States since then, it certainly has not been reduced. So all this violence has not had an impact whatsoever on the amount of drugs flowing into the U.S. In fact, Mexico has entered the heroin market, now the fentanyl crisis. So it's completely ineffective, yet it's having such negative repercussions. What are the numbers? Tell people the numbers. Because when I hear these, it's incredible how many people have died in Mexico. How many people a year are dying?
I mean, we're talking about between 25 and 30,000 people being murdered each year, basically on average in Mexico. 2017 was the most violent year in the last 25 years. I think it's close to 28,000 people who were murdered in purposeful homicides. We have over 37,000 people who've been officially denounced as having been disappeared over those 12 years. The real number is much higher. When family members go and they file a police report, they often report being threatened by authorities. There's a lot of reasons why people aren't coming forward to file police reports for disappearances. So we don't know how many have taken place sort of off the books. There's been clandestine mass graves found in every state of the Republic of Mexico except for one. So it's a widespread phenomenon. You have hundreds of thousands of people who've been forcibly displaced from their lands internally. And then you have a huge amount of people who have crossed over into the United States and, made asylum claims based on, having to flee this violence that they're experiencing in their home communities. So the effects in Mexico have been devastating. Mexico is not the same country that it was at all in 2006. And, I think the main difference between today and 12 years ago is just the amount of violence, the amount of massacres, the amount of mass disappearances that have taken place in the country and really destroyed the social fabric in a lot of the country, these kinds of extreme violences.
Now, in your book, you write that most of this is not actually about fighting drugs, but using the drug war as a cover to destroy indigenous decision-making structures so that the extraction industries can have their way. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in saying that these policies are a failure in terms of like reducing drug consumption in the United States, we've known that since Plan Colombia, right? Like we have clearly seen that these types of plans do not reduce drug consumption or improve public health in the United States. But what we do see is that they tend to improve the conditions for investment by large corporations. So in the book, I look at cases in Colombia of oil companies who use paramilitary violence connected to this war to have people displaced off their lands. Same with mining companies. We know that huge corporations like Coca-Cola, for example, have used paramilitaries to destroy unions and prevent union organizing in their shops. And so we see this sort of symbiotic relationship between large capital and the creation of this internal enemy, which basically tends to be young men. Right. And we see the same thing happening in Mexico. So you have campaigns of social cleansing in some cities and towns, really attacking young men. A lot of the discourse is very similar to that in the United States, saying these are gang members, these are bad kids, these kids want to hurt other children, these are bad young men. In the United States, they need to be locked up. And in Mexico, the state tries to justify their deaths, their shooting, their disappearance by saying, they were up to something bad. But what you see is a very similar type of social control, and it also in rural areas. So in rural areas, it might have to do with displacing whole communities off of lands that have, gold underneath or silver mines, or they're in the way of a pipeline, or they're in strategic areas like the U.S.-Mexico border where the the goal is to sort of control the amount of laborers and prevent labor organizing. But there's all kinds of side effects too, like small businesses end up closing because insecurity becomes so bad and extortion starts to ramp up with all this violence. Small businesses end up closing, and the businesses that stay open are like the Walmarts and like the huge supermarkets and the Home Depots. So you see like a transition towards an economy with less small businesses and less little shops on the corner and less markets that actually give local people a little bit more autonomy, right, in their day-to-day life.
So to rephrase this, we have paramilitary groups in Mexico murdering community activists on behalf of foreign corporations who want to come in and restructure the economy in their favor, and the government is presenting it as if it's cartel violence.
I mean, I would say that's a pretty good summary, but I think we need to go further than, say, murdering activists. It's also, it's just murdering certain segments of the population, but in a way that is so grotesque and so massive that, you know, people refer to it as social cleansing, right?
Wow.
So it's taking out, you know, the kids that hang out on the corner, the 15 to 25-year-olds that hang on the corner and drink beers and keep an eye on what's happening and who's coming in and out of the community. Those are the first people that, you know, are removed.
And so,
and they're taken out, disappeared, incarcerated, or murdered.
Absolutely criminal. So what percentage of the Mexican population understands this? Because I don't think many people in the United States do.
No, I mean, it's the discourse of the war on drugs. I think, you know, I'm sure you've talked about this in your show in the past, in the United States is so strong and it's so moralistic, right? So it's like here in Mexico, which is a very conservative country, it's a Catholic country for the most part, right? So there's this idea that, well, you know, something happened to Pedro, who lives on the corner, but he must have been involved in something bad. He must have been using drugs. As long as my family's not doing anything like that, as long as we're not, we'll be fine, right? So it creates the sort of discourse, the moralist sort of discourse of the drug war, creates a lot of separations and fragments people a lot. And the main source of information that people have on the drug war in Mexico or in the US is the media, right? And the media is just like, basically the media repeats what the police says, you know, what the Justice Department says, what the Attorney General says, as if it's the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And, you know, once in a while, you'll read a fantastic investigative expose about, you know, the ramparts or like the corrupt police in networks who are actually planting drugs on people, right? Who are who the people responsible for this, the border agents who are also serial killers and traffickers themselves. Like, but you get the odd piece of investigative journalism. But for the most part, the media is just repeating exactly what the government's telling us. And the state is just constantly saying that we need to wage this war basically on the bad people to protect the good people in a very simplistic sort of moralistic way that misleads the general public at large. I mean, there's growing consciousness, I think, especially since the disappearance of the 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Normal School 4 years ago. In Guerrero, there's sort of a growing consciousness that there's more at play, that there's something else happening that's not just what we're being told, but it's still, you know, we're still a far distance from having a critical mass of people protesting the drug war as a war for power, as a war for capital, as a war, you know, a reactionary war.
Yeah. There's none of that in the United States. Very few people have this kind of structural analysis. That's why I kind of call it the elephant in the living room. I don't think people understand the depth of corruption and the way the drug war and capitalism, predatory capitalism, are fused. It must be frustrating.
I mean, in the United States, we do have these examples of like the fantastic work of, you know, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, her book Golden Gulag, or Michelle Alexander, right, with the new Jim Crow. These very convincing arguments and very, very well documented arguments telling us that the war on drugs is being used as a pretext to mass incarcerate, right. young men of color.
Yes,
and
that
in
is
Mexico,
true.
we are a few decades behind. But I think that actually it's a similar kind of analysis. But the thing is, here they don't have a prison system that's big enough by any stretch to mass incarcerate on sort of the levels that they're doing in the U.S. So the methods here are connected more to disappearance and massacre.
Right.
But yeah, of course it's frustrating. I mean, it's like rowing like a little rowboat against the ocean and just being like, something else is happening, you know, let's shift the discussion. But there's there is increasingly, there's more voices, there's more people working critically on these issues. A new book just came out here in Mexico called Cartels Don't Exist. So his argument is that, the cartels are fiction basically made up by states. And there's just a more, it's gaining ground. It's gaining ground as a sort of alternative discourse. And when I present Drug War Capitalism here in Mexico, because it came out in Spanish just a few months ago, the response is generally, oh, yeah, this happened to me in my community, or that reminds me of something that I saw. Like, it's not a difficult thing for people to make connections between the kind of violence that they've experienced, which is primarily militarization.
Right.
But then, of course, there's also, there are people moving drugs, but it's really hard to tell who's a police officer and who's a drug runner. And I mean, it's very, very difficult for people who are living through it to tell who's who. But what they can tell you is that, it reduces mobility. It reduces their ability to communicate with their neighbors. A lot of people leave town. People stop going out, all kinds of stuff that basically makes people more atomized and more isolated, which I think is, what this is about. It's really about destroying the social fabric in Mexico because people are organized here.
Right.
People are organized from apartment building to apartment building. They're organized within family and extended family and kinship networks. And that kind of organizing can be activated at different moments in self-defense and in defense of the land and in defense of people's property and in defense of people's rights, right? And that's kind of what I think they're destroying through this kind of war.
Right. How long have you lived in Mexico?
I've been here for 6 years now. So I started coming down before, but I've been here really full time for 6 years.
Are you concerned about your own safety, especially now that the book's been published in Mexico?
I definitely have sleepless nights every once in a while, and I've had a few complications. But if I was deeply concerned about my own security, I wouldn't be here. I mean, I'm a Canadian citizen, so I could go back. I am deeply concerned about the safety of a lot of very close friends of mine, though, right? And colleagues, because these are people who are facing tremendous amounts of risks every day for speaking out against enforced disappearance, against massacres, for revealing, for publishing different kinds of reports. So that's what really keeps me up at night.
Right. Let's see if we can list off how should we call them? The hidden reasons for the drug war, the things we've been talking about here that a lot of people don't understand, right? A racist excuse to jail black people or to eliminate your political enemies in Mexico. The corruption, the sheer amount of money made in the drug war and how that trickles up to politicians, police, intelligence agencies, etc., right? That's And then also the multinational corporations that launder that money.
Right. I've done a little bit of work on that, and I think that the trickle up of the cash economy that is created through prohibition in the United States, it tends to trickle or move. Maybe it's not trickle because it's quite a significant amount of money, but it moves into the banking system, it moves into real estate. It gets recycled into the illicit economy. And what we tend to see in Mexico is that surplus that's created through that illicit economy that's created through a prohibition is heavily invested in arms, right? So in weapons, in vehicles. Right. So it actually it's an off-the-books way to strengthen paramilitary organizations, commonly called drug cartels, where the government doesn't have to buy them weapons or supply them with vehicles. They can do that through their access to all these illicit funds. And the thing is that those groups, the paramilitary groups, I mean, the definition of a paramilitary is that it's somebody who's not technically part of a state armed force, but who basically works together with them, right, in coordination with them. So it's a way of strengthening state power. You have, the displacement of people off of their land, pushing people off of resource-rich land. You have a sort of control of working people, right, by sending these messages of, bodies hanging in front of the maquiladora, as a suggestion, to anyone who might want to organize. There was a woman's body was found in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. She was someone who was active online on Twitter denouncing different crimes on her Twitter account, and her body was found wrapped in her keyboard and the mouse and everything in a central plaza, right, in Nuevo Laredo. So it's like that's sort of sign to, anyone who's publishing on the internet that, you're being watched and you could be next. There's been a war on journalism. The journalists who are kind of running the most risks are police reporters. Right. So people who are reporting on police corruption and on municipal level sort of corruption. So there's been a real sort of chilling effect on the media. You have sort of extortion networks that form. I mean, there's all kinds of side effects. It also creates just a huge amount of impunity. Just about, less than 5% of these crimes are actually ever investigated in Mexico. So it also just opens up this sort of open season on life, where then, an abusive husband just says, well, whatever, I'm just going to kill my wife because no one cares anyways, because there's so many people dying or there's so many people being killed, right? So there's all this sort of spin-off effects of this kind of extreme violence as well.
Mm-hmm. So are you continuing to do investigative journalism in Mexico around this issue since you published your book? Is that why you're in Mexico still?
Yeah. So I actually came here to do a PhD, which I just finished, and I did my dissertation work with a group of family members of people who've been disappeared. So basically, they carry out land searches every Saturday in the northern state of Coahuila. It's a border state with Texas. And these family members, they go every Saturday and they look for human remains. And they have found in the last 2.5 years over 100,000 bone fragments. They've actually managed to identify
They counted 100,000 fragments?
I mean, they count every time they go out. They do an estimate.
Wow.
So they have, but sometimes they measure them by kilo, like by weight, and sometimes they measure them by the number. But, I've gone out with them on a Saturday and found they estimate between 3,500 and 4,000 bone fragments on a single day.
Wow.
And those counts are agreed to with, state authorities who are there present. I mean, they're estimates. But so what they talk about is these killing fields. Fields around the city where young people or people who were being disappeared were basically incinerated in diesel, and the charred bones dumped in the desert. And these bones, it's pretty remarkable. Even though they're really tiny, they still contain DNA. So the same families have been promoting DNA testing for family members of the disappeared. And they get these bones that the government gets them DNA tested, and they've returned 19 people. 19 genetically corroborated bone fragments back to their families who now can sort of have closure. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've been working on.
Is your PhD?
Past 4 years is sort of those struggles.
Yeah. Is your PhD available to read online or?
Not yet. And it's actually, I wrote it in Spanish as well. So
okay.
I'm hoping this year, 2019, to go back to journalism for a year. And so hopefully I'll be getting lots more new stuff out because, Mexico has a new president who's taking office on December 1st, and he's promised a lot of changes. And, there's a certain amount of hope in Mexico that, things might improve and the violence might be reduced. But, we'll be there, myself and other reporters.
Right.
Let's see what happens and feet to the fire.
Right. Have you read Catherine Austin Fitz's article? It's called Narco Dollars for Beginners.
No, I should read that.
Oh, you should read that, because that really influenced me. I think it was back in 1999. She has a picture of the head of the New York Stock Exchange at the time, Richard Grasso, embracing a FARC commander, Raul Reyes. And according to her article, he asked them to invest their drug profits in the U.S. stock markets. And they said no, that the resources of Colombia belong to the people of Colombia, and they refused to do it. And that Plan Colombia, the U.S. government's, funneling of millions of dollars a year to the Colombian government to supposedly fight the cartels and the drug war, started just 2 weeks later, which the Colombian government only used to fight the FARC, not the cartels in the country.
Right. I mean, the FARC is not a drug cartel, right? The FARC is a guerrilla movement that started in the 1960s. And what we know basically is that the FARC did control significant parts of Colombian territory starting from the 90s. Mm-hmm. And so they were basically taxing some of the growers, right? So the people growing the coca leaf. But that's the sort of very bottom end of the profit making, right? And it was actually more of the paramilitary groups, again, who were linked with the Colombian army and who were responsible for most of the massacres that took place in Colombia over those years. That it was actually those paramilitary groups that were, closer with the drug cartels and making a greater share of the profit, much more so than the FARC. But again, whenever we get into these conversations, it's like we don't actually have proper numbers, right? Because it's all, it's an illicit cash economy.
Right. So
the thing that we do know is that most of the cash generated through the drug economy is generated in the United States, right? So between the sort of warehouse level and mid-level, and then the most profitable is mid-level street, right? And then street to final consumer.
Right.
That's where, a huge amount of the proceeds of the drug trade are actually generated. I have the numbers in my book, but, what a Colombian coca farmer is making is next to nothing compared to the proceeds being made in the United States. But again, of course, the people who go to jail for this stuff in the U.S. tend to be the street level dealers, right?
Right.
And the big guys, the higher level guys are, wealthy, prominent people involved in all kinds of legal economic activities with all kinds of protections as well based on social class, status. So I think it's always good to sort of keep that in mind.
Yeah, well, I just sent you a link to the article. It was written in 1999, so you can let me know.
To read it.
Let me know what you think. She also talks about the money flows of the drug war and how a large percentage of drug profits are laundered through Western multinational corporations, propping up their stock values. So her main thesis is that we are addicted to drug profits. She used to give this talk, and she said, if I had a big red button right here on the stage, and you knew that if you pressed it, you could end the drug war, but it would significantly decrease the value of your stocks, who would do it? And very few people would go up and press that button. That, because we literally are dependent, so many people in the US, on their stock portfolios. And when I hear about stories like HSBC getting busted for laundering drug money, it does seem like she's onto something here. That the money that's made in the drug war is the primary reason why we don't legalize and regulate drugs. Because if we did that, local governments could make some money, but not the kind of illegal money that's being made right now. Not even close.
I mean, I would just add a few more, and I think that's what the work of drug war capitalism is, add a few more elements to that argument. So in addition to that, which I think is a factor, you also have the way that this kind of war benefits the expansion of quote unquote legal corporate capitalism, right? So it can benefit mining companies, it can benefit oil companies, it can benefit maquiladoras through, these things that we were talking about before, the displacement of communities who are resisting a project, or the control of laborers. And then the other thing is that it reinforces state power. So these armed groups, they function like an extension of the military. I mean, sometimes they fight with the military, but other times, for example, the case of Ayotzinapa, which is very well documented, the 43 students, they were arrested by police and handed off to a so-called drug cartel. But most of the members of that drug cartel were themselves former police or had relationships with the police. So that's a way for the state to basically wipe their hands and say, well, we didn't do it. Right. It was these bad drug cartels that were fighting that did it. But when you actually start looking at the sort of details, you're like, but it was police that handed these kids off to the drug cartels.
I remember reading about that 4 years ago and posting some articles on social media about it, but I don't remember any kind of deep analysis about why those 40 students were targeted. Do you have an answer to that?
I mean, we don't. They're still disappeared.
Right.
To begin with, right? So there's been a huge amount of effort by journalists, by international investigators to sort of get to the bottom of it. It appears that those students were basically like a rock in the shoe of local elites. They were constantly protesting. They were very mobilized.
Oh, they were activist
radical.
Students.
They were activist students.
Well, that explains it.
So that's, I would say, one of the sort of theories, but really we don't. I mean, they've arrested a handful of people for those crimes. Those people have been tortured. We don't have like a solid, exact version of why this happened, why specifically those students on that day.
Right.
Primarily because the army has refused to be interviewed. And the army played a significant role in the events that took place that night, but they have not been interviewed. So we're just missing, a huge amount of testimonies from people involved.
Wow. Okay, have you read Politics of Heroin by Alfred McCoy?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I can't remember it all in detail, but it was really, really useful as I was sort of preparing Drug War Capitalism for sure.
Right. It's about CIA complicity in the heroin trade. And that's very significant because most people who really study this believe that the flow of drugs, and we're talking particularly heroin and cocaine, around the world couldn't really exist on the level it does without state support. And the state can't support that publicly, so their clandestine services do that. So the ISI in Pakistan is thought to be overseeing the production of heroin from the opium that's in Afghanistan. And we have friends who have come back from Afghanistan and told us that the primary thing they did there was protect the poppy fields. And so people wonder why we have had this, what is it now, 15, 16-year-long war in Afghanistan where nothing's changing. Can you speak about the geopolitics of the drug war? Because I think it's largely about controlling the profits and making sure they flow to the West and not to the West's political enemies like Russia or China.
I mean, that's, again, one angle. And then another angle is that, as we see in the U.S., as we see in Mexico, the drug war is an excellent discursive strategy to militarize society and to impose a kind of a militarized social control, right? So it's also a way of keeping populations in check, making sure that people aren't rising up, by criminalizing people for having a few grams in their pocket, or just saying, well, that person was a drug dealer when there was no investigation whatsoever, right? Like someone's killed and it's like, oh, well, he must have been doing something bad. And, the president even came out after a big killing that happened of a bunch of high school kids in Ciudad Juarez, a massacre at a birthday party. And he said, oh, well, they were involved in the drug trade, right? Like before there had been any investigation whatsoever. So it's also really convenient.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about it in Latin America, and I don't have experience in other parts of the world like Afghanistan or Pakistan or Burma or those countries, right? But here in Latin America, you could definitely argue that, after the Cold War, almost immediately after, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the start of the reconfiguration of global geopolitics, the drug war starts coming in as like the new bad guy, right? So now instead of communists, you're fighting drug traffickers. Now instead of subversives, you're fighting drug dealers. And it just kind of reconstitutes this map of who the internal enemies are and the need for the government to be constantly at war with part of the population is justified in this way, right? In the drug war. Whereas before here, in the Cold War, it was all about, communists and destroying the sort of the Cuban threat and all that kind of stuff. So, and you can see that in the kind of discourse, just looking through the documents, starting in the early 90s, it's like the narco threat sort of comes and stands in for the red threat pretty fast after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and there isn't enough Muslims in Latin America to use terrorism as the excuse.
Yeah, they can't because most people are Catholic, and it's also like, the U.S. and Mexico share an extremely long border. So it's not like you're talking about some kind of foreign population from a land nobody can understand. I mean, Americans go to Mexico all the time on vacation, right? Mm-hmm. So the whole kind of super exoticizing discourse of the sort of Islamic terrorist other, which serves the same kind of pretext, right, of destroying societies, of bombing societies, and going for their natural resources and preventing them from having, an Arab Spring and a meaningful revolution. It happens with different languages, which is a language that's wrapped around the war on drugs.
Right. Wow. So how do we organize against this? In many ways, it's a characteristic of our species to think in terms of us versus them. Projecting an enemy is a very easy way to channel people's thinking. And it's so hard for people to snap out of that, and particularly to realize that they're being manipulated through these simplistic structures of thought. Is it going to work to expose it, say, in the way that we're talking about it right now? I found a lot of people kind of gloss over, or they just otherwise don't want to think that our leaders are so nefarious that they would concoct an enemy to impose such violence.
I mean, it's a really hard moment in the United States to think about organizing right now around anything that isn't like reacting directly to the horrible stuff that's happening inside the US, right? Like it seems like there's a sort of a high point for organizing, for example, around the Kavanaugh hearings, or, it just seems like there has been, like with Me Too, with Black Lives Matter, like there's been like so many important mobilizations, but they need to be happening in the US and they're really focused on the US, whereas like post September 11th, we were definitely in a moment, a lot of people talk about it as a moment of a lot of closure and a lot of fear, but at the same time, there was significant, anti-war mobilizing happening in the US at that time, as well as in Canada, which you could say, well, it wasn't successful because the war still happened, but it happened. That organizing still happened. I mean, to me, I think that organizing against police violence in the US, like what Black Lives Matter is doing and others, cop watches and so on, is crucial. And it's not a huge leap to make the connection between like police violence in the US and US policy, in other countries, which is all about, the US police training police elsewhere to do the same kind of stuff they're doing in the United States. I think the United States political establishment would love to see a world where every country had as many prisons as the United States. The US is totally exceptional on a world level of like the number of prisoners, right? The number of people who are incarcerated. And the U.S. foreign policy establishment would love to make a world where there were way more people in jail in every country, like everywhere in the image of the United States. But in terms of mobilizing, I think prison abolition work is really, really important, bringing that kind of discussion into it. Obviously, anti-racist organizing, all the important stuff that's been going on with protesting these police killings, but not just as sort of like one bad cop kind of stuff, but really as structural has been really, really important. But also I think that, moving the conversation from, let's legalize marijuana. Yeah, that's fine. That's mainstream now. We can talk about it. Let's get behind it, to a decriminalization of all narcotic substances, and end to prohibition.
Right.
The public health discussion around addiction, not just addiction to narcotics, addiction to substances. The U.S. needs to have a proper healthcare system in general. These kinds of the bigger stuff is, I think, where, we need to go in terms of if we're going for another world, let's go for a world that's worth it, where people are protected and where people have, the right to choose what goes into their body, right? And they have the right to access to healthcare when they're sick, and they don't have to, use illegal substances because they don't have proper access to medicine or to healthcare or so on. So I think that like supporting those kinds of organizations and that kind of movement, which I'm sure you talk about on your show, is really important in terms of, this kind of reducing this kind of violence. Like we should end prohibition. There should not be prohibition.
Well, this whole entire podcast, like our episode 0, the first episode that we put out, talks about the goals of this show, and it's one of the main ones is to end the drug war. And I always say on many of our episodes that the number one and most important next step are state-by-state initiatives to decriminalize all drugs.
Exactly.
That's a way you can unite all the various movements, from the cannabis and psychedelic users who want cognitive liberty, the right to put in their body what they want, the civil rights angle to use drugs, and the opiate moms who are fighting against mass incarceration and a public health approach, not because they fighting for the right to use heroin, but because their children have died because of adulterated heroin, and the scapegoating and stigma that's put upon people who have substance use disorders that just makes the problem worse.
And, universal health care, right?
Exactly.
It's not disconnected. It seems like a lot of people end up using illegal drugs or drugs that are prohibited because they're not able to access proper health care.
Yeah,
or they were
issue.
Injured on the job, and then their employer fired them and they have no benefits, and so they have no health care. And so it's just like these cycles where it's like, if there were these institutions that should be in place in a country that has that amount of money, like the United States, a country as rich as the United States, everyone should be able to go to the hospital when they're sick.
Right.
Right. And not be self-medicating on, using substances where, like, Dawn McPherson, who's someone I respect a lot, who works on this stuff in Vancouver, Canada, like he says, with synthetics right now in Vancouver, it's like the well is poisoned, right? Like there's fentanyl in, showing up in cocaine, heroin, all kinds of stuff. And yet, so pharmacies should be providing tested substances for people who are using, whether they're using like once a month or whether they're using 3 times a day. There needs to be some kind of regulation.
Right.
Because otherwise people are going to keep dying as well.
Right. And decriminalization is just a next step, right? Because that's it's just makes it legal to possess drugs for personal use, but there'll still be a raging drug war on the manufacture and distribution of drugs and all the violence associated with that. But it's a great first step, right? Softens public opinion once they see how it works, how overdose deaths get reduced. Then they go, well, wait a minute, why are we now continuing to fight this? Then we can provide heroin maintenance programs for people. Exactly.
But that's the thing. So like when then, people say, well, the drug war is a failure, and it's like, well, it's definitely a failure from like a social justice perspective. It's a failure from a humanistic perspective, but it's not a failure in terms of social control. And here in Mexico, we can talk about it not being a failure in terms of, keeping populations under control, keeping the media in check, keeping the conditions for capitalism to expand into all of these different territories where people have been protesting and preventing these projects for years. It's actually quite a useful device for them to use to militarize the country and justify that militarization. So in that way, it's not a failure, because that's kind of the big thing. Like, it's not like the U.S. is repeating a failed policy with the Merit Initiative here in Mexico. It's just that the metrics they're using to measure failure and success are not the same ones that we think that they should be using or that we expect them to use, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the failure of the drug war, it's obviously like mass incarceration, all of these people who've been murdered, all of these people who've been disappeared. I mean, it's a disaster. It's obviously a huge failure on that level. But from the U.S. perspective, or from the Mexican government perspective, from the elite state perspective, it's actually a pretty useful way of keeping people in line, of keeping people in check, of keeping people incarcerated, keeping people down. Right. Which is what states increasingly need to do because of the inequalities, right? These inequalities that we're living on, the 99% and the 1% that you talk about in the US. I mean, here you can talk about the 99.99% and the 0.001%, right? Just extreme inequality. And how do states manage that kind of inequality? Maybe in some places there's still a redistribution of wealth and, subsidized education, for example, here in Mexico. And these kinds of things that still exist, but at the same time, the state comes in with a much more heavy hand and a more repressive way of managing those inequalities. Yeah. And the drug war gives them the perfect excuse to do that.
Yeah, right. When I was in college, we brought Michael Albert to speak on our campus. He's the editor of Z Magazine, where Noam Chomsky used to publish all the time. And he said in his talk, it really blew me away, that after World War II in this country, with the GI Bill and the wealth and the extreme growth of the middle class, we had the most educated population that we've ever had in the United States in the 60s. And that's when we saw all of this activism start happening, right? Everyone knows about the 60s, and that the elites learned that an educated and well-off population just caused trouble. And so thereafter began the skyrocketing tuition fees, and all of the subsidies going to education were removed, and now you have to go into a huge debt in order to go to college. And they're intentionally destroying the middle class because, you give them an inch, they ask for a mile, kind of thing.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think prohibition is a thread that, like you said, it connects a lot of these different struggles and a lot of these different issues because, in the 60s, at the same time, they really start rolling out the war on drugs, with Nixon, right? So the timing tells us, and actually Keeanga-Yamada Taylor's excellent book From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation she talks about that too, right? Like the hyper increase of policing, being deployed against Black communities and using that pretext of drugs as well, specifically as coming at a moment of Black uprising and Black rebellion and Black power in the United States. And I mean, we read as well here in Mexico with the drug war, right? Like at the end of 2006 is when the drug war starts. But the whole year of 2006 is a year that we talk about here as being a year of insurgency, of uprising, right? You had a rebellion in Oaxaca that lasted for months, huge successful struggle against a new airport outside of Mexico City in Atenco. You had, the election of López Obrador for the first time with the progressive president, which, there was fraud and huge protests against the electoral fraud. There was La Otra Campaña de Zapatistas. It was a year when there was a sort of political possibility at play, and that year ended with we're starting the drug war, send the military and the federal police and start training up thousands more soldiers, thousands more military, and really militarize the whole country. Wow. And it really has transformed the country. It's put a huge damper on a lot of organizing. Although on the flip side, it has also created a lot of new organizing, specifically, mostly by family members of the disappeared. Right. But also by family members of people who've been murdered and people really clamoring for justice in Mexico.
Right. Yeah, it does seem like they use the drug war. They ramp up the drug war when resistance movements start to get more popular and use it as an excuse to suppress them.
That's what history tells us, starting from the 60s and coming right through to today.
What do you think about Trudeau signing on to Trump's plan to reinvigorate the drug war? You heard about that, yeah? Trudeau is just, by signing this sort of statement about continuing with the drug war, he's doing what Canada's always done, which is fall in line behind the United States and sort of support U.S. policy globally. So he can make a statement or make a face at Trump or something, or, but in his actions, he's supporting all of these pipelines on Indigenous land. It's just a continuation of yeah, kind of like the Democrats in the United States, eh?
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. Well, hold on. I want to ask my wife something here. Tatiana, did Brad die in 2006? Yeah, he was a friend of ours. We were both in the Bay Area. She says yes, that it was 2006. So
it was. Yeah. It was.
Yeah, she was just talking all about Oaxaca just a minute ago.
It was in the uprisings in Oaxaca, right, in 2006 that he was killed, because by 2007 they had sort of shut down the uprising there.
Right. So what have we not covered? What would you like to say?
I feel like we've covered all the bases.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's going to be a heavy episode for people. Usually we're talking about harm reduction. I think
that for me, the thing to really keep in mind is that it's state policy that is creating this nightmare in Mexico. It's U.S. policy, it's Mexican policy. So obviously individual consumers of substances can make some choices about what they're consuming, but for other substances, like, there's not much choice. Like, you can't be like, I want the sort of conflict-free, right. fair trade version of this.
Yeah, and it really bugs me when I read articles from journalists blaming drug users for the violence.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to get at, and given, like, especially like the audience of this show, like. So I think, folks are using, and you just don't have that option. Like, same as buying gas station. We can't buy conflict-free gas. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, right.
So what do? Okay, we're using this commodity for one reason or another. But, as people who are using, I think that joining sort of activist campaigns or supporting in some way movements to end prohibition, but also, obviously anything in the U.S. around, status for all, no one is illegal, supporting these organizations who are supporting asylum seekers and migrants who are being displaced because of these policies, or, directly protesting U.S. policy is like, if you can't vote with your dollars, you can make statement in other ways or try to intervene in other ways so that, those choices become available, because there's no reason why it couldn't be that way. There's no reason why other substances couldn't be managed, the way, and I think we're seeing that with the legalization of marijuana right now. Like, oh, we could have done this all along. Right. And also everyone that is in jail for those offenses should be released, right? Like, This is sort of first step priority. It's, I think in terms of thinking about decriminalization or legalization is making sure that it's retroactive and making sure that people don't have criminal records that really haunt them, after.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Really.
Dawn's book is called Drug War Capitalism. I guess people can buy it on Amazon. Where do you recommend people buy it?
Yeah, people could buy it from Amazon from my publisher, which is AK Press. They're based out of Chico, California. I have a website, which is dawnpaley.ca, or you can find me on Facebook at my full name, which is Dawn Marie Paley.
Great. Well, thank you again. It was great having you, and be safe down there.
My pleasure. Talk soon.